The basic idea of post-colonial theory is that the age of European empires was enabled by a racist culture that still plagues us even now. Anything tainted by some link with the colonial era, whether modern science or Kew Gardens, must therefore be actively decolonized. Until then, ethnic minorities living in the West can never be truly free, for regardless of the de jure setup, they will remain victimized by a society built around the ideas, attitudes, and standards of their oppressors. One marvel is that so many of them want to come here in the first place. But with me to discuss whether there are more sinister motives at work in this push for decolonization than the intellectual pretensions of the activists would suggest is Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, an historian, royal broadcaster, and much-loved senior fellow at the New Culture Forum. Now, Rafe, thank you very much for joining me on The Forge.
Pleasure to be with you, Harrison.
If we look across history, slavery is about as universal a human institution as agriculture or marriage, frankly. Why are the countries who led the way in abolishing it, at great cost, in the case of the United States, at great human cost, 600,000 Americans dead in a gruesome civil war that completely ripped the country apart, and in the British case, more peaceful than that, but nevertheless, an immense financial burden levied by Parliament, and the debt I don't think we actually ended up paying off until around 2010 or something like that. Why are these countries singled out for their role in what, in historical terms, is in fact a very unremarkable practice?
You're absolutely right. You must wonder why it is that if you go to any academic institution in this country, if you watch any documentary produced by any sort of mainstream production company, Britain and America are uniquely guilty of their original sin, which is slavery. But of course, we know that this is not about slavery. I mean, this is a direct attack on Britain and America, more broadly on the West, but particularly on Britain and America and everything they stand for. And we know that this is not about slavery, because if it were about slavery, then we would have these same activists calling for reparations, for example. They would be picketing outside the high commissions of Nigeria. They'd be outside the embassies of Chad, of Niger, of Sudan, and Cameroon, because these are basically the nations today which have the highest levels of modern-day slavery. 800,000 slaves in Cameroon. You know, CNN reported a few years ago that every week there are hundreds of slaves sold in Libya. Pakistan is the global center of the slave trade, and yet, you know, we have Sadiq Khan, Mayor of London, calling for a slavery museum in this country for Britain to atone of its links to slavery. And yet, you know, and he's very fond of telling us all he's the son of a Pakistani bus driver, but he went on an official visit to Pakistan as mayor, and not once did he mention the issue of modern-day slavery. And surely saving people today is far more important than self-flagellating about issues from 200 years ago. And so it is clear, you know, the International Labour Organization said that 7 in every 1,000 Africans, 10 million people, are living in bondage. So where are these protests? Why does nobody ever speak about it? I would have far more time for the activists if they spent just as much time, if not more time, advocating for an end to modern-day slavery.
Yes, you'd expect that those cries to be made much more fulsomely if they really cared. And the fact that those cries are not made, or in the fact you don't even have to go around the world geographically today, just historically, no one's troubling North Africa for unjustly enriching themselves, in many cases at the expense of white Europeans and the Barbary slave trade. There's a very suspicious selectivity at work, and they're interested in when they're not.
Yes, so 1 million Europeans were enslaved by the North African states, or, you know, modern day Algeria and Tunisia and so forth. And if you look at it in the broader picture, Britain and America's footprint in the slave trade is tiny compared to, say, the Islamic world. You know, slavery has been going on from Africa to the Islamic world for hundreds of years, and in fact it carried on well into the 20th century. Some would say it still exists today. Now, why aren't there large African populations in the Middle East and elsewhere? Because the Arabs would castrate their slaves, so that there are no issue today. Also importantly, people need to understand and remember that no Europeans enslaved Africans. European ships were moored off the coast of West Africa, and there were slave markets built along the shore. And other Africans were enslaving their fellow Africans. And there were actually more Africans held in bondage in Africa than were ever transported across the Atlantic. So where are the calls for the Oba of the Benin, or for the Ashtonahé or Asantehane of the Kingdom of Ashanti? You know, these people are alive today. They are the direct beneficiaries of slavery. They were enriched by slavery, and yet, of course, you will get wonderful exhibitions about their culture and their civilization. We just had a movie a couple of years ago called The Woman King, which was celebrating the warrior women of the Kingdom of Dahomey. Now, the Kingdom of Dahomey was the most brutal slave trading nation or empire, probably, in modern times. Not only were they brutally enslaving other Africans, they were engaged in annual human sacrifices. Not once was any of that mentioned in this Hollywood blockbuster where everybody was celebrating these women. But it's impossible to imagine a film today being made about, General Lee, or about anybody from the Deep South in any sort of iconic way, even though, of course, their alleged crimes pale in comparison with the reality of what we saw in Africa.
It's worth mentioning the case of Robert E. Lee as well, not to make excuses as such, but he was not particularly keen on slavery as an individual man.
But that's my point.
Indeed. But he felt a kind of a state loyalty to Virginia, and that was what primarily dictated his decision to be the main general on the part of the South in the American Civil War. There are two pillars. So we've established, and we will establish further later, that a lot of this is actually not these claims. The sort of single-minded obsession with the crimes of white European ancestors is very suspicious. And so these people are clearly not acting in good faith if they're not bothering the High Commission in Nigeria, if they're not bothering modern-day Pakistan or other places within Africa. So that's established in advance. But taking their claims seriously for a moment, there are two main pillars, I would say, to the push for reparations off the back of claims about slavery. One of them is sort of an unjust enrichment theory, and the second is the idea that the descendants of slaves are still suffering continuing net harms, and those need to be rectified. So if we begin with the first, how crucial can we say that slavery really was to Britain's economic success? To what extent did Britain enrich itself from slavery?
Very little, if at all. In fact, there's a very strong argument to be said that the cost of maintaining the empire negated any profits that could have possibly been made from slavery. And you have to essentially understand that the reason Britain was able to embark upon the slave trade and to embark upon colonization was because it was already a rich country. So it's actually the other way around. It was because Britain was developing so rapidly that it was able to embark upon that sort of process, and ultimately empire was a status symbol. The countries that had the biggest empire were the most important countries, and so even though the benefits weren't that great, the prestige that came from having an empire was what essentially was the driving motivation for much of the European expansion. Oh, well, Britain has it, I've got to get involved in this game. Yes, you saw other countries taking part in all of this. And we know that that slavery didn't have any impact upon industrialization, because countries like Switzerland and Germany industrialized without having any slave trade. Switzerland never had an empire, for example. Germany came very late to the whole process of empire. The Scandinavian countries didn't have an empire outside of Europe. And beyond that, if you understand, places like Spain and Portugal, which were the leading countries of the slave trade, I think Portugal had 2/3 of the amount of Britain had 2/3 of what the Spanish and Portuguese had. They, of course, were not the powerhouses driving the Industrial Revolution, whereas if you're going to follow the logic of these activist arguments, they should have been the powerhouses of it all. And if you look at the most profitable areas of the slave trade for the British Empire, it was sugar in the Caribbean. And in 1792, I think it was, which was the peak year of all of this, only 3% of capital formation in Britain was around the sugar industry. Now, if sugar had been such a profitable industry, you would have money flooding into it from all sorts of investments. It would have been 30% of capital formation rather than 3%. In effect, it had precisely the same contributions to the British economy as the trade in hops and barley. And I don't recall anyone saying that beer was the driving force behind the Industrial Revolution. It's quite simply, it's absurd.
It would be very strange if it was true as well, because not only were there European countries which had managed to industrialize and become first world economies in modern age, and they have definitely enriched themselves without embarking either on an imperial project or a slave trading project. You've got lots of non-European countries who've been practicing these sorts of things for centuries and don't enjoy anything like the first world riches that Britain does, which did practice slavery for a time, of course, and the Portuguese and the Spanish. I mean, Benin, which was one of the most important slave trading powers in Africa, and also engaged in ritual human sacrifice in the 19th century, it's not as though off the back of that kind of tribal enslavement that they have become, they're not hardly leading the world economically. Likewise, the Mongolians, rampaging across Europe, did not achieve the levels of riches that I think historians like to call the great divergence, the way in which Europe and the West has just completely set itself apart from the rest of the world economically since around 1500. Neil Ferguson has his book Civilization, which goes into the real reasons why that was the case, and not once does he mention slavery or empire, which are arguably two of the least imaginable things that Europeans did in that era. So it's hardly going to be sufficient to explaining an economic miracle, a world historical economic miracle like the Great Divergence, to point to practices, whether slavery or imperialism, which great powers have been doing and are continuing to do today for centuries and indeed millennia.
I think that's fundamentally important, and what we really should be asking, rather than trying to find a negative reason for the success of the West and for Western ascendancy for the last 300 years, because prior to the 1700s, Asia was primarily the dominant cultural and sort of military and economic powerhouse. But why in those 300 years was the West ascendant? And it's not from a negative basis. It's from a very interesting uniqueness of the Occidental mind to the Oriental mind, or more broadly to the global mind. There's a professor called Joseph Heinrich at Harvard who wrote a book called Why Are We Weird? Or about weird, or weird is Western educated, industrial, rich and developed. And it's a very interesting theory he has, which I'm actually inclined to go along with. And he traces it back to, well, obviously it's due to the ingenuity of the West, but he dates it back over 1,000 years to when the Western Church, later to become the Catholic Church, banned a cousin marriage. So marriage was only allowed between certain degrees of consanguinity, and also prohibited taboos, incest taboos, polygamy, and so forth. And almost immediately in the Western hemisphere, in the Western part of Europe, where the Western Church dominated, you had the death of kinship and clans. So you no longer had a situation which still exists everywhere else in the world outside Europe, where essentially you have first, second, third, and fourth cousins treated as if they're brothers and sisters within the family. So these great clan networks ended in the West, and instead of that, you had the birth of the nuclear family. And in over 90% of the world does not have nuclear families. This is a uniquely Western European tradition, which of course we exported to North America and elsewhere. And because of that, suddenly Europeans had to rely on strangers, and therefore you needed to have a high level of trust developing. And as all the economists will tell you, social trust is one of the driving forces of innovation and economic prosperity, and it leads to collaboration. So these small families ended up having to rely on others, and this is why you get the development uniquely in Western Europe of guilds, of universities, of charter towns, of confraternities. And with this cross-pollination, ideas are born, and people with different talents and suddenly decide they can choose their occupation for themselves. And it was through this that you have this burgeoning of it. And through that, you get to the development, essentially, of urbanization and of companies and so forth. And they all developed from this, accidentally, from this policy of the Western Church. And you can really trace it into small levels. I mean, in Italy, this policy of the Western Church was only really applied in northern Italy. And that's why in that country there are so many great disparities between the south, between Sicily and so forth, and then the north of the country.
The north being
much richer. And of course the south of Italy is more what we would call it, more corrupt. And corruption is another factor that we associate with non-Western countries as being one of the impediments to their development. And there's much less corruption in Western Europe and North American countries. And one of the reasons for that is because a key distinction in judging social trust is how do you automatically react to strangers? How do you react to foreigners and so forth? And we know that levels of trust are much higher amongst Westerners. And, it's led to all sorts of curious changes, even to the way that the Western mind thinks compared to the non-Western mind. Now, nothing is quite as black and white. There are gradations of all of this throughout the world. But broadly speaking, in the most basic terms, the Western mind, the memory, spatial reasoning, visual perception, these are different in the Western mind than more broadly you will find elsewhere. One of the reasons that the Westerners are actually the worst in the world at facial recognition is because we only use the right hemisphere of the brain, whereas in other cultures, both areas of the brain are used and focused. And so that all of these reasons lead to a very different perception of the world. And then, of course, you had the advent of Protestantism, which was fundamentally important because it led to the rise of literacy. I think Neil Ferguson's very strong on that sort of thing too.
Yes.
So there are a myriad number of reasons why the West succeeded in a very short space of time compared to elsewhere. I mean, you can even tie it into things, for example, Westerners have a very different attitude. I mean, there's no such thing as guilt, for example, in places like China and so forth. Those cultures, discipline is enforced, moral norms are enforced by shame, bringing shame on your family. Whereas for the Westerner, it's about individualism. It's about, I've let myself down. And there's that individual spirit, which has also been the driving force of innovation. For example, if you spoke to a European and said, or an American, because actually these traits of individualism are far more pronounced in the Anglosphere than in Scandinavia and then in the rest of Europe. But if you were to ask a person in the Anglosphere, who are you? You would say, well, I'm Joe, I'm a lawyer, I'm a curious person, and I'm a stamp collector.
Yes.
If you ask somebody in China or India, for example, they'll be far more likely to say, well, I'm the son of X, I'm the husband of Y, and I'm the brother of so-and-so. So everything, again, is about family as opposed to individual. So there are very fascinating reasons for the ascent of the West, and we don't need to look in the darkest corners to find that solution.
And it's also rather regrettable that we seem to be, not least through some recent demographic imports into places like Britain and into places like the United States, backpedaling on some of those enabling conditions of prosperity and high trust. And so, go on.
Yeah, yes, it's a funny point because they've done an analysis of parking tickets in New York.
Oh, yes.
from members of the United Nations.
Okay.
The only people to pay their fines, the people most likely to pay their fines, are from the Anglosphere, and then from Scandinavia, and then to a lesser degree from the rest of Europe. But you have other places in the world where they just simply don't pay their parking fees because they have immunity. So
it's worth bearing in mind as well that these people, presumably the people who are parking outside the United Nations building in New York, won't be from the hinterlands of these places. They will be the elites as well. So it's clearly not a class thing either. So another thing worth mentioning for Americans in the audience about the unjust enrichment case made for reparations is that the American South was hardly, an industrially mighty power. It in large part lost the Civil War precisely because it was an agrarian backwater, which was not very advanced economically, was not mobilizing human labor in maximally efficient ways. And even Eric Hobsbawm in I think it's the second of his second volume in his tetralogy on modern history, The Age of Capital, concedes and says this at length that the South was much less economically developed than the North, and in spite of having better generals, which Eric Hobsbawm admits, Eric Hobsbawm being a left-wing Marxist historian for people who don't know, it was because the North was more industrially mighty and more industrially advanced that it was able to win that war. And so, again, you would expect, if slavery is really such an economic boon, you would have expected the South to have had a decisive economic advantage in that struggle. And of course, then that 60% of their wealth was wiped out by the Civil War anyway. So they're clearly not still benefiting from those riches, any riches that were gained on the part of a small minority of Southern aristocrats.
Yeah, I mean, you can even make a comparison with modern-day Britain because we have relied for the last 30 years on mass immigration rather than investing in capital infrastructure, So this reliance simply on, the crudest form of labor, cheap workers coming over to do these jobs rather than investing in, say, machines to pick apples off the trees and so forth, things that could have advanced us far better than relying and lowering wages for everybody else.
What do you make of the idea then? So that's the unjust enrichment case, and I think we've established that it's pretty weak. What do you make of the idea that the descendants of slaves, whether we're talking about in the Caribbean, the case of the British slave trade, or whether we're talking about African Americans, the descendants of slaves in the United States, are still suffering continuing net harms from their ancestors' brush with slavery in the 17th century and onwards?
Well, I've often asked people to provide me with evidence of in what ways precisely are you suffering from the plight of your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, because we're talking about 8 generations ago, 200 years ago, and no one has ever been able to provide me with any evidence of how they are directly suffering. On the contrary, and it's a controversial thing for some to hear, had the lives of black people in America, in the Caribbean, in Britain, are far better than if their ancestors had never left Africa. And that's entirely quantifiable. The life expectancy in Benin is, I think, around 61. In Barbados, it's 79. Right? 18 years more life. Benin, of course, was where many of the slaves came from to the New World. If you look at the GDP per capita, it's approximately $1,500 a year in Benin. In Trinidad, it's $19,000 a year. In Barbados, it's $20,000 a year. So we're talking over 10 times more wealth generated from that. So, and of course, the lives of black people in this country who descend from slaves, infinitely better than they would have been. So I can't see how anybody can make a claim to reparations. Particularly fundamentally, people need to understand also, reparations are a matter of tort law. The purposes of damages under tort law is to put the person, the victim, into the position they were in before the damage was caused. But that can only happen to you in your lifetime. It can't go down 8 generations. We don't have some sort of inherited right to benefit from the suffering of our, I had family, killed by the Nazis and the communists. The idea that I would try to somehow put in a claim for reparations is absolutely absurd. So I think we need to sort of consider things in that light. Bayard Rustin was a great civil rights activist and was given a friend of Martin Luther King, and he was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Barack Obama. And he said, if my granddaddy picked cotton, he might be entitled to some money. I didn't pick any cotton. Nobody owes me anything. And more humorously, Muhammad Ali, when he was doing the Rumble in the Jungle in 1973, was asked what he thought about Africa, and he said, thank God my granddaddy got on that boat.
Exactly so. Exactly so. And so it's one of the odd things about history. History is a sort of a very, very multifaceted, complex affair, and, very clear, or what seemed to us, very clear, evident wrongs that were done to Africans, not least by their own co-ethnics in West Africa, but also by the Europeans who took advantage of that lack of fraternal spirit in West Africa. Those wrongs don't necessarily percolate intergenerationally, and although this is very difficult for people to accept and it's quite counterintuitive, when you look at the evidence, if anything, they are, as you say, beneficiaries of their own ancestors' brush with slavery because they enjoy first world riches. I think African Americans themselves are the best fed, best housed Africans in the world. They have a very, very, very light tax burden compared to other ethnic groups in the United States, and so they are easily net beneficiaries of the American welfare system, not least since the 1960s. I've even seen, I don't know what you make of this, I've even seen many people argue that the billions and billions, and maybe even trillions that has been spent by the US government on a sort of in-kind reparations since the 1960s, since L.B. Johnson's Great Society, is a kind of in-kind reparative payment anyway, and that this has been paid off in the same way that we have already paid it off by spending all of the money that we did, only paying off that debt in 2010, abolishing slavery in our empire in 1933 in the first place. What do you make of this idea that we've, even if there is not this inherited debt that we have today, even if it is not sort of philosophically and morally defensible, there is a sense in which we've paid it off already anyway, both in the case of the United States and in the case of Britain?
Yeah, I mean, no country has done more and paid more to abolish slavery than Britain. Slavery was universal, but what was unique was that Britain and a couple of other countries, led the world in the abolition of slavery, but then Britain took it upon itself to become the world policeman. And through the West Africa Squadron, it spent 2% of GDP, the sum equivalent to our entire defense budget, in forcing an end to the slave trade. It's the only example in history, I think, where a country has deliberately made itself poorer in order to advance a moral incentive. And there are so many different ways you can even look at it. CARICOM, which is the organization of Caribbean countries that are seeking reparations from Britain, supported by an ICJ judge who said that Britain and America owe $12 trillion for the reparations of slavery. One of the reasons that these Caribbean countries are so successful is because of their British inheritance.
Yes.
All of the money that the British spent there on the infrastructure of the country, universities, hospitals, establishing a civil service, establishing a judiciaries, the police, the military that was set up there. And the gifts that Britain gave to the Caribbean enabled them to become part of the global financial networks, the English language and the common law system and the levels of education. So the majority of Caribbean countries are middle-income countries with a quality of life on the UN's Human Development Index that is higher than places like Mexico. So in what possible way, and when you compare that to the countries of West Africa where they formerly came from, I mean, it's ludicrous. But one of the reasons that organizations like CARICOM and others, and also Indian nationalists, are so keen to make this case for reparations and not to concede any of the benefits of colonialism is because if they accept any of the benefits, then they are going to have to acknowledge that many of the faults in those countries lie within themselves. And it's far easier and it's far better to actually blame Britain for all of the ills that they have, that everything is tied. I mean, even, this Indian politician wrote this book about, all the bad things Britain had done for India. And he said that, he was even blaming the caste system on the British Empire.
Is this Shashi Tharoor?
Yeah, Shashi Tharoor.
Yeah.
Inglorious Empire is the book.
That's right.
Quite remarkable. When, again, one of the great benefits. Look, I shouldn't have to say it, but you have to sort of preface these things with one of these caveats, saying it's not as bad as saying I acknowledge the land on which we're sitting belonged to the Cree, but it's along those lines. Yes, I acknowledge the empire did many bad things, right? But everyone knows about that because you can never stop hearing about it. So we hear, look, slavery was terrible. Had we been around in 1807 or 1833, I would be supporting reparations for the people who were alive and were victims of slavery. Obviously, yes, there were horrendous things caused by the British, although no empire in history was able to maintain its empire with so little recourse to violence and oppression. This is, there were very few soldiers actually involved in maintaining the empire. This is hugely important.
Yes.
But where we did go, what did we do? Stopped slavery in Africa. We were enforcing an end to the slave trade, much to the resistance of Africans who wanted to continue it. And Britain had to actively use force to stop Africans enslaving other Africans. The French also very successful. That's a process that lasted into the 20th century. Also had, freed from oppression, women, who, of course, today we know women in India are very politically powerful, Indira Gandhi and so forth. Women wouldn't have risen to prominence in the former British colonies had it not been for the presence of Britain. And also, if you look there are so many different areas in India. The British stopped suttee, the burning of widows on the funeral pyres of their husbands, so stopped the infanticide of young girls,
yes,
and also allowed Hindu women to remarry. They stopped also in New Zealand, for example, headhunting. They stopped human sacrifices in Africa. They tried to stop female genital mutilation in East Africa. So there are so many reasons for people living in those parts of the world to be thankful for the legacy left to them by Britain.
Yes, indeed. And I'm glad as well now that getting away from slavery and speaking about colonialism more broadly, because of course they're often very cynically elided. Of course, when you have a colonial power which is engaging in slavery, fair enough. But what about when you have a colonial power which is busily abolishing it in all of its domains and also fighting a war against it on the high seas? So broadening the discussion to speak about colonialism in a larger sense, I think it's very correct what you say about how there was clearly an implicit consensual relationship going on between a couple of 100,000 or so. Maybe we'll pick India as the archetypal example in the case of Britain. A couple of 100,000 or so white Britons stationed in India administering the empire, and a huge Indian population. I think it was actually Lord Hardinger, the Governor General and Viceroy of India from, I think, something like 1910 to 1916, who once quipped that if every single brown person in the land were to take up a handful of sand and by united effort throw it in a white man's face, we should be buried alive. It wouldn't have been possible for the British to rule without the implicit consent of colonial subjects in places like India. So the idea that they're still suffering a net continuing harm now because of that colonial administration, when their ancestors clearly implicitly consented to it, is rather hard to swallow. But nevertheless, you will get people coming out and saying that Britain looted India, Britain drained India economically in order to refocus those sorts of finances on their own industrialization. I think one of the figures that's being thrown around is the 45 trillion figure. What exactly do we make of this?
Yeah, well, this comes out of a nonsensical book written by a woman called Mukherjee, I think it was, and very poorly researched. Only looked at the most scarce sort of statistics to back this up, and there's 45 trillion seemingly plucked out of the air. But people like Thoreau and others have basically publicized all of this. It's very complicated to go into the different myriad reasons why it's false. But one of the main reasons is because the argument is that the profits made by the British and by the British Empire in India were repatriated back to Britain, whereas they should have been invested in India. And it's quite easy to demonstrate why that's completely false, because only half of India was actually ruled by the British. The other half was ruled by the Indian princes, by the princely states and so forth. And so all one has to do is look at pre-colonial India, before the British arrived, and then look when the British were there at the Indian states to see how much they invested in the country and what the benefits of that investment is. And if you actually look at how they invested money before the British came in alongside the British, I'm afraid the case falls apart, because Britain was investing. But of course, it's quite right when you invest that you take the profits back, or some of the profits back with you. But of course, the incentive is still to invest because you want to still make more profits.
Yes.
And the levels of investment by the Raj, by British India, was still greater than from the Indian Council of Princes or from the pre-colonial times.
What do we think is
Oh, sorry, one other thing too.
Sure.
The other argument you always hear is that, before the British arrived, India had 23% share of the world's GDP. When the British left, India only had 3%. And, the sort of Neanderthal reasoning behind that is simply as Britain drained India of all of this. On the contrary, the only reason is that the rest of the world rose far faster than India did. In the 1950s, I don't know how large America's share of GDP was. Phenomenal, right, of global GDP. It's much lower now. Yes. That's not because anyone's been pilfering what America has. It's simply because the rest of the world has developed.
Has been catching up. Let's get to the more sort of sinister ulterior motives going on here, because it seems to me that, it actually goes back to a little bit to what you were saying earlier about the way in which we are weird. And I think that actually makes us easier to manipulate and easier to, what would be the word, intimidate psychologically than we would be if we were these sort of tribal, fire-breathing ethnocentrists that obviously you can't run a state, but it actually gives you a bit of an advantage when you have a very diverse population and one group is not particularly ethnocentric, it doesn't really think in terms of its group identity. I mean, you won't get white people in Britain saying, we want more white people in rap music, whereas you will get black people saying we want more black people in being football managers, for example. There's a clearly asymmetric level. There are clearly asymmetric levels of ethnocentrism running within diverse populations. I do think it does make us more manipulable, because we take these arguments on good faith, and people like you, and it's a credit that you do it, and that the people of history reclaim will debunk these things at length and go in sort of painstaking detail. But I get the sense that the people who are really spearheading this are not at all interested in the facts. It's not so much that they've gone through Britain's history or America's history in a disinterested fashion, looked at it, discovered all sorts of outrages, and then come dispassionately to the conclusion that this justifies a sort of blood libel against white Europeans. It's more that they begin with that sort of vindictive resentment, and then every single sin that our ancestors committed, exaggerated, blown out of proportion, becomes a pretext for precisely those kinds of appalling claims, which are routinely now made against the culture of Europeans, the heritage of Europeans, the prosperity of Europeans. I mean, what is the demand for reparations if not, an attempt to pilfer from an incredibly rich and well-meaning part of the world? And so, how do you think we should approach this? The problem of motivation here? Do you think that we spend too much time focusing on fact-checking these sorts of issues, and we should focus more on the clearly sinister motives of the people spearheading the project in the first place?
I think one has to do both, because the level of ignorance of history is so great in this country that it's very easy for people to be convinced by spurious arguments and fake history or distorted history, unless somebody else is presenting the facts simply and plainly and clearly without an agenda. Historians are supposed to pursue truth objectively, but of course, in this postmodernist world of ours, objective truth doesn't exist any longer. And so what these modern-day historians are doing, and then the activists are doing, is they're setting out with a thesis, and they're trying to prove it. And they are either completely distorting history, or they're selectively choosing history that puts us in a bad light, and they are exaggerating what happened, and they're refusing to give any credence to anything possibly positive. That's why I spend so much time saying what I'm doing, whilst acknowledging the bad stuff, because everyone knows about the bad stuff. And the entire thesis of this is that everything that Britain and the West have is built upon slavery, it's built upon genocide, it's built upon oppression, it's built upon exploitation. And once you view it like that, you see actually that these people don't care about the facts, because the facts simply get in the way of their good story. And it's a war on history, because by undermining a nation's history, you dissolve the connection between the people and their sense of place, their sense of identity, their sense of belonging. So we have to understand what this is. It is a deliberate attempt to demoralize and destabilize the West. And it's happening from within, and it's happening from without. So, if you look at Russia, they're always talking about the West's history of empire and genocide and all of this. China doing likewise. Yeah. And of course, we don't know how many of these activists are actually, on social media and so forth, are being paid for by the Russian and Chinese government.
Right.
Because it's a very important aspect of demoralizing. It's like Yuri Bezmenov, the KGB agent, the 4 stages of subverting a society and imposing a new ideology are demoralization, which is the process we're going through with all of the history, then destabilization, then creating a crisis where you can impose the new ideology, and then a normalization where the subverted ideology becomes accepted as being the only true situation. And we have completely subverted our history already. All of our values and beliefs. I try to explain to people Britain is a post-revolutionary society. The revolution has already taken place, and we are now the counter-resistance. We are the revolutionaries, meeting in small places to have our meetings and so forth.
Right.
So this war on history is all about eroding a sense of community, because the nation-state is the very foundation of a people's, and of our democracy. It's what Roger Scruton said is the we,
First person plural. Yeah.
Just, think of Churchill, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender. And once you erode that sense of we, and once you make people either distrust or hate their history, they become much more easy to manipulate and to take over with a new ideology. And that's what we're seeing happening. And I think it's being implemented through, I think this is at its root a Marxist, with shades of postmodernism, a Marxist ideology, but it's only a small cadre of people who are the Marxist leaders of all of this. But their foot soldiers, the useful idiots of theirs, are a combination of people who are essentially nihilistic and have an almost perverse masochistic pleasure in hating themselves and hating their culture, and that's rampant amongst our youth, as well as the be kind, the liberals, just simply are trying their bit, doing what they think, and they're easily hoodwinked by all of this. But at its root, it's Marxist. James Lindsay has this wonderful analogy he makes with the genus of a cat. And he says cats are the genus, but then you have tabby cats, you'll have lions, you'll have tigers, you'll have jaguars. And in the same way, the post-colonial theory is an element of Marxism. So you have traditional Marxism, or the bourgeoisie and the proletariat being the oppressor and the oppressed, and that's an attack on capitalism. You then have radical feminism, which is an attack on men, but also the values of masculinity that made the West so successful. You then have critical race theory, which obviously is an attack on whiteness. Then you have, what else do we have going on here? We have queer theory, which is obviously an attack on heterosexuality, but most importantly, an attack on the family. And post-colonial theory, which of course is an attack on our history and all of the achievements of the West being completely undermined. And they're all linked, of course, through intersectionality. But taken together, yes, that's a lethal recipe for destroying the West in every aspect that made the West successful.
Would you agree with me, though, in saying, just as a quick, because one of the concerns I have about over-intellectualizing the motivations of our opponents, I don't doubt that there are people who sign up to every jot and tittle of this new catechism, and it's all very, it's all very arcane, and it's all very, Gnostic, and there are all sorts of features of it which are like a religion into which people opt, and then people are, it's not so much people really do subscribe to these ideas. But I get the sense as well that there are a lot of people who are attracted to these ideas or attracted to the language, not because they've studied Herbert Marcuse, not because they've read Angela Davis, but particularly among sort of tribalistic minorities. And we have these people in the country, people like Sadiq Khan, people like Humza Yusuf. I don't suspect these people have been busily reading critical theory texts. It's more that they feel, and this comes across in their rhetoric, a kind of ethnic resentment against the host population of Britain, and they are intent on spreading a foul blood libel against the ancestral population of this country. And they are drawn to this ideology because they have those feelings at the outset, rather than they learn the ideology and then act it out.
Oh no, but that's my point. I think that the progenitors of these ideologies are Marxist. So I think that critical race theory is a Marxist theory. These are all Marxist theories, but as I said, it's only a small cadre of people who are creating this stuff who are Marxist. I don't think the majority of people are. But yes, you can add ethnic resentment to all of this. But these ideologies that's trying to essentially inspire dissent and inspire disruption and cause disintegration of our society. But I'm not saying that everyone's Marxist.
Sure.
Simply that I think these were born out of Marxism, different types of Marxism. That's why I try to never use the word woke now. I try to say American Marxism, because it is American Marxism. Because Marcuse and the Frankfurt School, yes, the roots are in Europe, but they came to America after the Second World War, and in 1968, Rudi Deutsch coined the Long March through the Institutions. And they essentially did understand that it was going to be minorities that were going to be the source of the revolution, and all of those things I just said to you, those are all minority interest groups.
Quite. Do you think as well that, and this problem became very apparent to me when we were actually both attending, well, you were speaking, and I was in the audience at a Cambridge Union debate, which was devoted precisely to these issues, and the question was something like, does Britain owe reparations for colonialism and slavery again? They were elided in a very irresponsible way by the Cambridge Union team. But one thing I noticed is that the audience was incredibly hostile to you. There was lots of heckling. Not all of this is caught on the YouTube video, but people can see a bit of it, and the eye rolling in the audience, people being very rude, looking on their phones. I was in the audience. There was a sort of palpable disdain in the audience. And don't get me wrong, a lot of that disdain was directed in a very ideological fashion against you, and I think Calvin Robinson, who was your debating partner, by sort of self-hating whites in the room. I'm not saying that this is purely a minority obsession, but one thing that I noticed very, very strongly is that the exactly the sort of thing that we're talking about, standards of academic rigor, standards of historical objectivity, I think that these things are much harder to defend and maintain when you have people in the audience from with post-imperial grudges in many cases, because this was the Cambridge Union audience, lots of Indians there, lots of Bangladeshis there, lots of diverse peoples from all around the world. And it didn't seem to me that they were very well primed to hear your position at all, because they came to the room with a sort of post-imperial grudge, and then they were keen to sort of grind ethnic resentments, racial resentments, religious resentments in many cases. And it's one of the counterintuitive things about diversity, isn't it? You would expect that the more diverse a population is, the more people are going to get used to hearing lots and lots of different perspectives. And this is what we're always promised, that there will be a kind of vibrant concatenation of ideas which lead to the best ideas to win out. But what you actually get in practice is whichever group is willing to angle for its own interests in the most non-negotiable, hardline way, trying to pass laws which make it impossible to criticize them and all these things. This is an example I like to use. Like Gladstone in the 1870s was making speeches against Islam and against the Turks because of what they were doing in the Balkans. He even wrote a pamphlet on the matter. I think he called it something like The Bulgarian Horrors in the Eastern Question in the 1870s, about what the Turks, kind of atrocities that the Turks were committing in Bulgaria. And he made comments about Islam and the Quran, which would have him thrown out of every single mainstream political party today, despite being of the Liberal Party. I think the only party that would happen today would be someone like the SDP, perhaps, although he would have disagreed with them on free trade, of course. But imagine if Gladstone had had a huge Turkish diaspora, at critical mass living in his Greenwich constituency. He wouldn't have been able to speak as freely on those sorts of things. So slightly long-winded way of putting it, but to what extent do you think that increased ethnic and religious diversity in Britain makes reasonable debate around empire, around history, around the past just impossible to have, because you've got too many people who are willing to see the issue single-mindedly through what they regard as advancing the perceived interests and reflecting best on their own ethnic or racial or religious in-group?
Well, we know from all of the sociological and economic evidence that increased ethnic diversity leads to a lowering of social trust. It leads to divisions within society. Communities become less harmonious. People even become more introverted. They don't go out. You see deterioration in the quality of buildings in your local community and so forth.
Yes.
So increased diversity by every measure is damaging to the social cohesion of a society, is economically damaging, and it increases community tensions in every respect, and is damaging to democracy as well, because once you have diversity of a critical mass from certain groups, then suddenly they become single issue groups where their own ethnic or religious interests supersede everything else. And of course, we've seen that in candidates at this election, where they have quite clearly said they don't care about healthcare or education. They're standing for Palestine in these sorts of elections. And so, we need to recognize that, every week almost you have a police commissioner or a mayor saying that diversity is our greatest strength. I think diversity is our greatest dilemma, and with multiculturalism and mass immigration, it's actually now becoming our greatest problem.
You say we're living in a post-revolutionary era, and let's hope that the counterinsurgency continues apace, and let's hope we've done a fair bit to help it along here. Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, thank you so much for joining me on The Forge.
Thanks so much. A pleasure.